Education through the Orthodox Christian Network. This is also a ministry of the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm Michael Haldus, and I always say this for anybody that may be joining for the first time. We're actually in a room full of people seated around a table, and we're going to continue our discussions, and I'll get to the topic in a minute. We welcome people that are listening online to type in the chat box any questions they may have. Anything I don't see real time, I always get to during the week if there are, in fact, comments, but we invite you in, if nothing else, just to listen to what I hope to be is a dialogue, not a monologue. So let me monologue a little bit, though, having said that. So the broad theme this year has been icons, Christ in life, and we've just really been examining our faith through an iconographic lens, which is hopefully taking us a little bit deeper in our understanding, or at least giving us another means and way to discuss our faith. The last several weeks, we've actually been discussing what it is that God has given us, what He's implanted in human nature that enables us to have the experience of God and to see and experience the truth deeper than what's on more or less the surface of life. So I'm going to start off I've been floating out definitions of the nous or explanations, because it's not exactly easy to understand because we don't really have a word for it in English. That's a great translation, but this is something that St. Maximus the Confessor said. And if anybody's familiar with him, he's one of the, I guess I could use this word deeper. He's just a very deep Holy Father. So sometimes he's hard to understand. But this is what he says. When God, the Logos, created human nature, He implanted in it a certain noetic capacity through which men could enjoy Him in an inexpressible way. So I like that one because I think all of us, and we've talked about it in this room, I think when we've sometimes tried to describe our experience with God, it feels somewhat inexpressible because sometimes language fails us to recount the experience, but somehow yet we know what each other means because of the shared experience. I like that. So last couple of weeks too, we discussed God's essence and energies. We talked about synergy and cooperation. So what I'm going to attempt to start to do today is maybe tie this all together in a meaningful way that can be helpful. So just as a really quick recap before we begin the dialogue on St. Gregory Palamas's teaching on essence and energies is, St. Gregory Palamas, who lived and died in the late 13th and mid 14th century, famously wrote about essence and energies. And he said, we know God by His energies, but not His essence, right? We can't see God in the totality of who God is, or even in the totality of His holiness, because it's too much for us, right? That's why there's actually this whole phenomenon called death by holiness that you see it in the Old Testament in particular, when those that were, God withdraws sometimes because He knows His holiness is too much. And until, and the whole thing about our nous is the continual cleansing of our nous. So we grow in holiness so that we can approach God in a much, in a more full way. So John, I think you pointed out or asked a question last week or the week before about, St. Gregory Palamas died in the 14th century. So was this brand new teaching? No, it wasn't. He was building upon what was articulated probably most clearly by the Cappadocian Fathers, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and they had said famously, we know God through His energies. St. Basil the Great said, but we do not claim that we can draw near to His essence, for His energies come down to us, but His essence remains unapproachable. This is where we get, apophatic and cataphatic theology. Is everybody familiar with that?
No.
Well, it's okay. So I have to be. It's expressing. It's how we express the truth of God, right? In a negative or positive way. I don't mean negative like bad, but like we hear in the liturgy, God is incomprehensible. God is ineffable. It's more accurate to define from us because of our limitations what God is not versus what He is. But it's also fair to say God is love, God is light, God is life. I mean, those are all. It's just that the Cappadocian's father said, it's better due to the limitations of language. It's just easier, or it's more accurate to describe and what God is not. And then St. Gregory of Nyssa, who was St. Basil the Great's brother, said, the true knowledge and vision of God consists in this, in seeing that he is invisible. Because what we seek lies beyond all knowledge, being wholly separated by the darkness of incomprehensibility. So I like that. I picked that because I think it's interesting, juxtaposing seeing the invisible. How do you see the invisible? Well, you see it through the nous, and separated by the darkness of incomprehensibility.
Is it really seeing, or is it more feeling?
It's seeing. It's seeing with our heart. Seeing with, yes, it's feeling, but it's not just feeling, because sometimes an inexpressible truth makes its way into your heart, and there's not a feeling associated with it necessarily, positive or negative. It's just an understanding. So it can be feeling. It's wonderful when it all comes together, when you have the joy of that emotional feeling and God gives it these emotions. It's wonderful, but it's not always based on feeling. And he says the darkness of incomprehensibility. Link that to the language in the scriptures. What's the very first thing in Genesis? Let there be light, right? Let there be light. And then Christ says in John 8:12, I'm the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. He was saying that right during the feast of the Festival of Lights. So imagine someone in massive spotlight and massive bright light saying, I'm the light of the world, right? It wasn't the physical light per se. It was the light of the truth and understanding. And then one of my all-time favorite scriptures, 2 Corinthians 4:6, for it is the God who commanded light to shine out of darkness. I like that, as opposed to shining in darkness. Shines out of darkness. It reminds us that even the darkness is subservient to God. Subservient to God. I was, anyway. So all of this, the nous, we talked about understanding the Old Testament. All of this is very difficult because we're in a post-Enlightenment culture where we're taught to distrust anything not literal. If it's not literal, it's not true. And you're just all a bunch of wishful thinkers that aren't grounded in pragmatic reality, and you really need to get your head screwed on right? Okay? Stay away from people like us. We're crazy, right?
I hear it all the time.
It's wonderful for science. It's needed in science.
Oh, it's nothing's wrong with it. Again, it all gets to be priority order, how it all comes together. We tend to be reductionist in nature. Should we pick off things? Like, okay, so some of the greatest scientists I know are these grand thinkers that bring their literal and pragmatic understanding in conjunction, in subordination to something greater. And they just know that they're using this scientific method as a means of truth, but there's always more things to learn. So it's I don't think it's mutually exclusive. But think about how our Lord taught. We've said it a million times. He taught through parables primarily. He didn't say, here's the rules, this and this, learn them, memorize them. We're going to have a quiz on Monday. And he always said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Again, to your point, he meant hear, but he meant something more. It's hearing, with our nous, with our perception. And as grace would have it, I was listening to something yesterday that I had no idea when I sat down to listen to it that I'd be able to pull it into this lesson. But I was listening to the Anglican priest and poet Malcolm Guite. Anybody familiar with him? Yeah, I really like him. But he pointed out something I thought, I didn't think about this before, but he pointed out, in similar to how Jesus taught in the parables, he was reminding the listeners of the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. You're all familiar with that. Do you remember who finally called out King David about his sin? Anybody remember? Nathan the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
Remember what Nathan did? He told a story.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't just say, hey, you slept with your best friend's wife and had him killed. I think David would, if he had approached David in the court like that, I'm sure David would have been like, well, he's crazy, off with his head, right? But he said the story about, the rich man and the poor man and the lambs they owned. And after he told the story, David got incensed about this man. And then Nathan said, it's you. And that's, so my point being is literal truth has its place, but we can't be locked into that if we're going to understand.
There is just so much truth we can bear.
Yes.
Like Moses.
Like Christ said, I have more to say to you, but you can't bear it right now, right? That he said that in John 15 or 16, right? We can, all of us can only bear so much at a time. And it is really, it's proportional too to how much we're, united to Christ and allowing ourselves to be, we're made clean by him, but how much we allow that, on our end, the synergy. So now that I've monologued, let me get to some questions. Okay. So, relating this to essence and energy and the energies in the world, my question to begin this discussion are, what energies are present in the world? Are God's energies the only thing present? I see head. You can't see it on screen, but one head shaking. One hand's up. Evan, go ahead.
I can address that. My name is Evangelos. I'm the bearer of good news. I always look for it.
We have the gospel present with us, right?
We got carbon. The carbon atom has to be a result of God, and I believe God is intelligent design. The carbon atom is incredibly difficult to create, if not impossible. And it cannot be random. It had to be through intelligent design. The world, the universe that keeps expanding relies on carbon, and we rely on carbon here on Earth. But I was struck by the fact that creation of carbon could not have been random, not at all. And from a scientific point of view, and to your point, pragmatic point of view, that's what and that comes to me every now and then when I think about it in church, and when things come to you in church, you really do need to pay attention to them. So that's where I address the scientific practical with the Trinity. So, hope that makes sense.
It does. It's interesting to me too, because my experience with things that are scientific like that is my reaction is very much like yours. I see things like that. I read about quantum physics, whatever, and my reaction is always wow about God. Right? Some others do not draw that conclusion. They'll have that same knowledge and information, and they don't see it that way. That's not their experience.
And so I wonder, a lot of atheists out there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not one of them, but there seems to be a war on carbon, and it could be coming from the atheists.
That's a bit of a conspiracy theory.
But not
anti-carbon. To have a discussion,
not without a kernel or something that's worth discussing there, because where I'm going, and hopefully what we'll discuss here, is really paying attention to the energies of the world and what drives us. Right.
Well, there's things called Lohizmi.
Can you define that just in case?
Well, it's thoughts or it comes like logic if you think of that. But things that enter your mind that tempt you or divide you from God, planted by demons.
That's where I was going when I was shaking my head. But to Everett's point, wonderful point, kind of reminds me, don't know how I like to bring in books or plays or whatnot into our discussions, but it reminds me of the book, play, movie, Inherit the Wind.
Oh, yeah. That's good. I like that.
Where
it was about the Scopes monkey trials,
Right.
essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, they're talking about God and, saying, man may learn to fly, but birds will, and their ability to fly will lose their wonder. And that's why, to Everett's point, that kind of leads me to think of the intelligent design, and that's correct. But I was going where Nick was going here in terms of, you talk about energies in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about Christ before, his crucifixion, where he was, where the devil, where Satan, offered tempted him to give him the whole world. So there are other energies in this world, and much like we've talked about for years in this room, our goal is to try to focus on the proper or right way, although we do sin and fall, but to get back up and keep trying to keep that focus, because temptation is ever present and isn't going anywhere.
Keep that, I would say, keep that connection, the branch to his vine. You said something about, so the temptation in the Luke version of the temptation, the devil says to Christ, all this authority I will give you and their glory, for this has all been delivered to me and I give to whomever I wish. You guys remember when we spoke about that? It was probably months ago, maybe last year. I don't remember. But that authority was delivered to him through the abdication of Adam and Eve in Genesis. They abdicated authority. And then Christ, by his defeat through the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension, takes it back. That's why one of the very last thing he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. So the energy we choose to participate in is, are we participating in his authority and his victory, or are we participating in the last rebellion before the final defeat? And I would say my point here is not for this discussion to be so theoretical and esoteric, but is to get us to pay attention to what is actually driving us. Like, this is really stupid on my part. What motivates us, right? Like, I'll give you, this is a silly example, but it just popped in my head. So I'm watching TV the other day, and there's a remake of the movie Roadhouse with Jake Gyllenhaal, the original Patrick Swayze movie. Mm-hmm. And I was like, cool, I want to see that. And my wife's like, why do you like to watch movies where people just beat the crap out of each other? And I started thinking to myself, why do I? But my point is, that's kind of a benign example. I thought to myself, why do I want to watch that? What is it that I like about that? What about what kind of combative spirit do I have? Like, what is it that I, that may seem benign, and it may be, but my point is, that's the level of paying attention to that I'm saying, because, Paul, a quote here from Elder Thaddeus, he says, God didn't create evil. Evil comes from noetic spirits who turned away from God's love and toward themselves and ceased to obey God, following their own way of reasoning. So is me wanting to watch a violent movie, is that benign, or is there something to that? No, it's probably not. Paul says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. It's this, the spiritual powers, principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness of this age. Christ, we understand Christ's entire victory was a spiritual victory over the spiritual powers first and foremost, right? The defeat of Satan. And that's why we talked about before, when he said, I come to bring liberty to captives. Everybody didn't get it. They took it more literally. They were so mired in worldliness, they didn't see the bigger picture. We're entering into a presidential election season. What energies are going to be present from our leaders? What are the things they saying? Are they saying things to unite everybody in Christ-like love? Or is it all about tribal division to get votes? I don't know, but I'm saying pay attention to what's what I'm for myself and for others. Pay attention to what's driving you for this stuff, right? Because look at our Lord, the nature of the Holy Trinity, unity in diversity, one God in three persons, but unity. Anything that makes, like, for instance, that makes diversity a club to cancel people. If you don't have the right kind of diversity, or diversity in terms of driving division, what energies are behind that? I don't know, it's throwing it out there for conversation.
Yeah, I've brought this up numerous times in this room as well, but when I think about those energies, and I probably need to go back and rewatch this movie, because I don't know if Mrs. will let me. But a movie I watched a lot of times and played years ago when I used to teach Sunday school. The Mission.
Oh yeah,
Robert
De Niro and Jeremy Irons and Liam Neeson, right?
Yeah. Pardon me?
Liam Neeson was in that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
A very young one.
Yeah. He got killed in the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the end, when things are all falling apart, you see two different energies taking place. And I never really thought about it in that way.
De Niro versus Jeremy Irons.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the only reason I bring that up is that I never really viewed it in that way. I viewed it more, not in terms of energies, but in terms of who's being more Christ-like and who's more sinning. But now that you put the energy focus on it, that kind of makes me think, well, sometimes, Jeremy Irons and et cetera are kind of giving into God's will versus, De Niro, who's like trying to fight it, kind of more like, Adam and Eve, and it kind of gives a different perspective on how it applies to us and how we deal with the world and how or we should deal with the world.
Yeah, the way that movie ended, I mean, spoiler alert, if you've never seen it, Jeremy Irons was a priest, and during I forget what was exactly going on, but there was a lot of violence. And Robert De Niro was a convert to the Catholic faith,
Yes.
but then I guess when the church was whatever was being the mission was being,
Brazil versus Spain, handing over lands. That was.
but when the fight broke out,
Yes.
De Niro chose to fight back. He gets killed. Jeremy Irons was walking down the street with the cross, and he gets killed too. But he had a non-violent protest or non-violent. So that's what we're talking about, the juxtaposition there.
Right.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of how we live our daily lives, we talk about the energies that we try to focus on, to try to make a difference. Are we, especially as we approach Lent, are we, speaking words of positivity and lifting people up, or are we still, being more gossipy and putting things, even though you may not have bad intentions, like your very benign example of the
Roadhouse.
of the movies. I mean, it all kind of
Okay, I'm gonna get shame comments coming.
yeah.
I probably need them.
It all juxtaposes together in terms of, because the whole point of this is, after we walk out of here, how do we react? How do we do?
What do we pay
perform?
attention to? It may change our, like, I heard this and it made me think about it. Like, especially when we're dealing with worldly things, it helps somewhat to remember who's in control and really believe it. And maybe this story in the gospel is helpful in that regard. When Christ was sleeping on the boat amidst the storm, the disciples are freaking out, right? He just gets up and says, "Where's your faith?" and calm the storm. So when we're in the storm, do we really trust that God's in control of it, and that it does? I'm talking about political scenes. So does it change our conviction? Does it change our vote? I'm not saying that, but maybe perhaps it changes our orientation to what's going on. And it's not, because there's so much doom and gloom, right, going on. And is there really doom and gloom, or no? There's real worldly circumstance, but there's real worldly. It doesn't negate the literal realness of what's going on, but does that mean that we have to move forward with the energy almost as if it's all in our control and hopeless, or if we understand that God's in control? Just something to think about. These are things I tell myself sometimes, because I think the energy of division. I think a lot of these things are very present. I think that I'm going to read you a quote. Do you want to say something? Because I want to read you a quote and get your reaction to it.
I'll read the quote, but I have one more thought.
You can share it. You want?
No, I'm just thinking about, in terms of the energies too, and again, things I've said in this room before. I think the energies also have a lot to do with our own personal relationship with Christ and how we perform and how we live.
Of course.
And I think that's something not to lose sight of, that, we go out and try to have the Christ-like energies versus the non-Christ-like energies.
Good,
I was
Mary.
just going to say, I think that all energy comes from Christ. And that I don't care whether it's good or bad or whatever, he allows it to happen. And then it's us in our noose that tries to understand and make sense of it. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it does, because he's ultimately in control, right? So,
Ultimately.
and we've talked about,
That's
out
free will.
of God's love, he free will,
Right.
free will among the angels, free will among the people, free will. We have free choices, but it doesn't negate, again, he's sleeping in the back of the boat because all is well, and he knows that, So I'm saying it's not,
Allows it to
but
happen.
but what do we do? How do we? Because to your point, like, staying connected to Christ is what's important in terms of availing ourselves of the goodness of God. Remember we said last week that God is goodness. I mean, it's not a separate thing from him, participating in God, in God himself and goodness. So, and I think you said too about, we sin, but when we sin, we have to remember to pick ourselves back up and turn back to God and not double down and start getting into self-judgment, which then again, it separates us from God. And although we're being recriminating, remorseful, the wrong direction of energy is then what leads us maybe into a bad path, right? Because we're not turning back to God. And remember, God, he said, I read it last week. You're a branch to my vine. We have to stay connected.
The two words just strike me, and just sitting here listening to this, energy and essence.
Mm-hmm.
If you're after essence, I mean, it's fairly easy to begin with, and it gets increasingly harder and harder. And as you think you approach answers to divine essence, for example, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of commitment and a lot of faith, and it gets more and more. It's not catastrophic, but the closer you get to the essence, the more energy it requires.
The closer maybe you approach the essence, the more the energies of the world because the energies of the world are real, the principalities, and there are forces here that are not forces that draw us close to God. So we have to mount up our energy, God's energy, through the tools we've been given,
Right.
prayer, and to fight and have a spiritual warfare. Saint Theophan the Recluse wrote about that.
Yeah, actually, I have.
Because these energies are real.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if we'll get to. I have several quotes I included here from him because he wrote so directly and clearly about a lot of that. Go ahead, John.
Can we also include in this conversation that this is not simply about our personal relationship with Christ, but it's also what we do to redirect that energy? I mean, our faith is a communal faith. So I think we also have a responsibility to convey that love that we receive to others. We can choose whether we want to redirect that energy in a positive and loving way or in a negative and divisive way. But I think that's an important part of this discussion also.
Yeah.
How do we channel that energy that we receive from Christ?
I'm not sure that you actually need to channel it. Excuse me, I see that you had very quickly.
No,
I
I
was gonna
think
say-
you're speaking.
Okay,
Go
Saint
ahead.
Seraphim said, acquire the spirit of peace, acquire the Holy Spirit, and multitudes or thousands around you will be saved. And it's when he says that, I interpret that as being, it's not direct. You don't actually direct it to anybody. It just sort of flows
It
from you in a
emanates from you,
passive
of course.
So when you say direct it or how do I channel it or something, I'm not sure you can really channel it except.
I'll accept a better word. But
Yeah.
the sense of what I'm trying to convey here is that what do we do when we have this energy that is illuminating us? I mean, and this is going to sound very gossipy, so everyone here forgive me, but there are people that I know that consider themselves to be super pious people, and they don't treat other people very well. So I'm sorry. So
Got a whole lot of that going on.
So you receive the energy and you don't emanate it properly towards others. Is that really what is the proper outcome of?
No.
So that's what I'm thinking about.
Because
here.
that's not even.
Somebody far wiser than me once said, we all have a moral obligation to bring joy to other people in our lives.
We do.
And not, commiserate and whatnot, to bring, even in our darkest days,
We do.
to bring joy to other people. It's an important part of a life well lived. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? That could look like a lot of different ways, right? How you, first of all, you said share. My experience has been, I guess it's been your experience too, that your motivation to be in this room, to live your faith, is very much similar. Like if you read a good book or you see a great movie, what's your instinct? Hey, read this, it's great. You're not getting paid for it. It's just you want to share. So what does that look like in your life, right? For me, a long time ago, I decided, you know what? These gifts of writing, speaking, such that I have, I remember sanctifying them, and one thing led to another, and here I am. So it's just, so I just chose to take whatever gifts I think I have or what, you know, and put them to use for other people as best I can within the limits of my ability. That probably, I mean, it applies to everybody here. You have professions, you have skills, you have desires. And then how do you love other people with those things? Is really,
And vice versa. How do you warn people from the things that are divisive or take us down a
Yeah.
bad pathway?
well, one of the ways to do it obviously is to the best of your ability, practice what you preach.
Good example.
If words are coming out of your mouth, you better be living by. I don't read those scriptures about teachers will be held in greater account all the time. In Matthew 12, 36 through 37, we're going to be judged by every word we use. That's literal. I told you that. So it's very important. And of course, I don't know if it's the paradox, but the beauty of all of this is that when sin is present, grace is more present. And like Paul said in Romans, that doesn't mean you go out and sin more so you can get more grace. Right? That's a literal, stupid way to understand that. It's that when you really do fall. I don't know if anybody's had this experience, but I bet you have. I know for my pet sins, when they get me, right, I almost always feel immediately God's presence more sharply than before. And I have to be reminded, don't look in the mirror and beat myself up and self-flagellate. Just make sure I'm turning back to God in prayer, seeking repentance, doing the things of repentance, whether it's coming to formal confession, being sorry, apologizing to the person, asking forgiveness, changing my action, whatever it may be. It's that, and that's talk about the joy. Talk about experiencing the joy of the Lord. When you fall and still know God loves you, and me know it through the news, what greater joy does that make? I mean, you have to relate to that, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying everybody expose their pet sins. I'm just saying that's the energy of God. That's what Maria's talking about,
Also, though, running the energy into John's wonderful point, there are people that I've come across, or at least my news feels this way, that, when you meet them, you just instantly know they're holy. You just get that calmness and that sense. And, like when I was a teenager in Greece, I met a monk who just
Still
something came
remember
over
it.
him.
Still remember it, right?
Yeah.
And saw a miracle while I was in Greece at that time too. But the person that comes to mind that just I just feel holiness emanates from this person. And I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. It's just what my news says to me is our former Archbishop.
Which one?
Our former Archbishop, Demetrius. I just feel like being in his presence several times, I just get the sense of holiness and godliness and light emanating from him. And and I'm using him as an example. There are other people who are like that. So I don't want to.
I got something to say about that
So
too. Go ahead, Maria.
What you're perceiving too is the fruits of the spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what
Good way to put it.
You know-
Christ is.
It's funny. We have I think you may know him, but Father Maximus, right?
Oh yeah.
Father Maximus Urbanowitz. I think he's still in Florida.
Mhm.
Maria and I, we've always said this man is filled with the Spirit. So I called him when they were talking about different things, and I asked him some questions, and he said the same thing. He said he saw that with Archbishop Demetrius, he had that experience.
Mhm.
And if you listen, and if you've been in the presence of Father Maximus, it's like it exudes from him. And it's funny. I read Archbishop Demetrius's book on prayer, and it was beautiful. And then I remember feeling so sorry for him that he had to be stuck in the mire of a church administration because that can suck the soul out of anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, 'cause I remember before he was Archbishop, when we hosted a YL conference in the early 90s in St. Louis, and we brought in then Bishop Demetrius to be our keynote speaker. And he just was, that was the first time I had met him, and it just, I don't know. There's just other, like I said, there are other people that are like that you meet that just their light shines forth, and I almost feel like saying, for us, we should try. Whether we succeed or not is another question, and certainly not for me to judge. But we should go try and do likewise and let our light shine, like you said. Like light's the first thing in Genesis, and Christ says, "I am the light of the world."
Mm-hmm.
And this, to me, comes down to the energy of light through the fruits of the Spirit that we've been graced with.
Yeah, there's a couple. It was interesting too about the depending on the English translation, you can make a case that you look at the order of the fruits of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit. The first one's love, and you can make a case, and some Bibles have this, where it's like love, colon, and all the rest follows, versus love and then comma, and then all the rest are comma. So it all flows from the heart of Christ-like love, the fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, and I think it's wonderful when we come across people like that who we just experience their light.
By the way, I think Father Stephanos, I think he knew him as a young man from Greece. Father Archbishop Demetrius.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think he had similar feelings about him.
Yeah, no, I mean, when so many people say that about you, it's a testimony. So there's something to be.
That light certainly rubs off on Father Stephanos.
Absolutely.
Very wonderful man.
Yeah, we're blessed to have him here. So we got some time. So you're still not having enough time. Yeah. So you talked about, John, what we do or don't do, right? I think that's what you said, or what. So I had a question here. If we have an opportunity to do something good, but don't make the choice to do it, what energy is driving that decision? Something to think about. And the quote I was going to read, I just want to get your reaction to it. I have a ton of quotes. I'm not going to read them all, but I just was pulling them together depending on which way the conversation went. But this gets to the essence of what we're talking about, this noetic perception. So it says this: noetic perception is this phrase that describes the ability of the human heart to perceive that which is divine. As such, it is our capacity for communion with God and the whole creation. Primarily, what we noetically perceive of creation is its logicity. It's the reflection of the logos, right? So, when we talk in a very neutral way about the logos, Christ, he's the organizing principle of reality. So all of reality, the goodness of reality, is, to Maria's point, is Christ. Without such a perception, we don't see the truth of things. By the same token, without such a perception, we cannot know the truth of ourselves. And we ever lie to themselves or realize they did? You're like, oh, no, I know. And one day it hits you, you're like, oh no. So, of course, goodness and truth are as endangered in the secular world as beauty. A world that cannot see goodness and truth is a world in which distortions and even lies are raised to a place of prominence. And here's the real convictor. In a secular world, money and violence become the primary energies of governance and change. It's pretty damning.
Who said that?
This is Father Stephen Freeman.
How long ago?
Not too long ago.
Oh, okay.
He's still alive. And I was in a meeting with him the other day. He's still alive and wonderfully feisty and sarcastic and brilliant.
Is he the pastor of a church?
Not anymore. He's retired. So he just writes these insightful blogs. And we all have our thing, right? All of us that do ministry work. And his thing is always the attack on modernity. Not the attack like he's trying to bring it down, but just always trying to point out, these things. And he's a pretty deep thinker and seer. And but when he speaks, if you ever had the privilege of listening to him speak, he doesn't go all deep dish where you can't understand him. He's really funny. He's a funny guy and quirky and sarcastic.
Where does he live?
Tennessee.
Like Nashville?
No, Oak Ridge. That's where he was.
Yeah.
So, but he's really insightful. So
he gave us a great concept that simplifies so many of the other things that we talk about, Michael. And it's the title of his book, The One Story Universe.
Oh, One Story Universe, yeah.
And that encapsulates so many things that we talk about here, right? It's not two stories, it's one.
Yeah, exactly. I discovered, I think I've told you the story before. So, my process is like when I create something, my process is to put it all down. And then I go back to validate because I want to make sure I'm not out in left field. One of the worst things for anybody who teaches or facilitates orthodox discussion is to be espousing their own opinions that have no foundation in the faith. So it's really, you want to make sure you're working hard to make sure that you're checking yourself. And that's why, like, I won't have anything published that doesn't go through a body for checks and balances. But when I remember, I wrote all this stuff down, which eventually became my book. And then I found him. I'm like, why did I do this? His is better. I told him that. I don't even remember it, but he kind of laughed. But it was wonderfully simplistic in a good way to understand that there's no separation between the sacred and secular. And of course, for the last 300-400 years, that's all we've been in, is this continual reduction of putting things in buckets. Us religious people, that's nice, having a nice little religion in this bucket, but but it's not. So a lot of times what I'm doing in here is I'm just coming at the same thing from multiple angles, is to help us reintegrate, because we would at even 500 years ago, we would not had to have this discussion. It would just been assumed. Like, for instance, in the scripture, you may read the English, the fool says there is no God, right? That's not a statement of atheism. What that is a statement of, it really means the fool does not follow God, rebels against God. There's no presumption God doesn't exist. That's not even a thought, like where today it is, right? There is no, everything that's come down to us came down in a framework of understanding the reality that a tree is just a tree, but what's the divine principle behind the tree, right? Now, to us, it's just a tree. Oh, you think there's a divine principle? Okay, there's no difference. So we live in that. So we always have to combat getting into such a literal mindset that that's all there is. I'm not saying that it's not true, but that's all there is, and that's why. Understanding the Old Testament, for instance, is really difficult because
I have problems with it.
Everybody does. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. It's a work of a lifetime. And the Pharisees did, because remember, Christ had to unlock the scriptures. He said, John, somewhere in Gospel of John, he said, you search the scriptures for eternal life, and you missed the fact they're talking about me. Everybody missed it.
The whole thing's about me.
Yeah. And even the disciples, even after he was resurrected and he's with them in a form, sometimes they recognize him, sometimes they don't. They're still asking the question, when are you going to nail Rome? Right? It wasn't until the Holy Spirit and the noetic unlocking, if you will, that they got it. And then, yeah.
I always think of, remember those two guys on the road to Emmaus?
Yeah.
Remember, they didn't recognize him.
No, and one was Luke, most likely. The other one was Joseph's brother.
Joseph,
his stepfather, or his earthly father, however you want to call it. That was his brother. You would think he would recognize Jesus. No, Cleopas.
Wasn't it when he broke the bread?
Yes, right. He was known through the communion. That's how we know the Lord. And that's what he gave us to know him. Right. That's why it's important for us to continually come to communion, do everything to prepare properly, not in a rigid pious way, like we're disqualified, but in a sincere way, right? If it's on Friday and you forget and bite into a piece of steak, you're not necessarily disqualified from coming to communion, right? Some people act that way though. Oh my gosh, I had a cheeseburger, I forgot. But if your reaction to that was, oh well, who cares? Then maybe you should put the brakes on. You know what I mean? But if you're like, oh man, this just shows you how forgetful I am, Lord, forgive. There's a difference. Yes, okay. So I guess my question would be then, in this context that we're talking about, then how does what really is temptation? How does temptation work?
Doesn't it come through your thoughts?
That's where it starts.
Short-term fix for the bigger problem.
Sometimes impulsive.
Impulsive, right? And because we're being ruled by the passions, so the impulse just takes over before you're like, oh my gosh, what did I just do? That kind of
You're forgetting who you are. Really.
But then on the other hand.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, sometimes to overthink, ponder,
hmm
hearing we're all talking about energies.
hmm
Sometimes it's a good idea to just kind of say, wait, let me just see how this feels. That can be good too.
Yeah, overthinking is not a great thing. I'm very cautious actually when I put stuff together like this. I try to be mindful of how much I maybe tapping into triggering someone to overthink. I was dealing with someone not too long ago, and I won't say the specifics, but they were talking to me about a certain condition, and I remember it took me an hour to respond to something really simple because I didn't want to touch off the condition by saying something that would make somebody think they have to be overly prescriptive in what they're doing, right? I don't know if I was successful or not, but none of this is meant to be that. None of this is meant to make anybody ever leave this room and think, oh my gosh, I got to remember these 7 things and do this or do that. No, it's just different ways to, but you said it, Joseph. It starts in our thought. And that's why, even though the sin is not the thought, the sin is the action that the thought comes from, right? What we do, right? It's not good. I mean, getting back to myself as a failure, it's not good if I imagine hitting somebody.
The brain will go where it wants to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a lot less good if I hit the person, right? You know what I'm saying? So it's the action. However, it doesn't mean that that managing our thought as best we can isn't important, because Christ said, don't even look. Remember the example of the adulterer? Don't even look with the lustful thought, because he knows where the thought leads. So,
Yeah, so I agree that I think the thought is actually as important as the action. We sin in our thoughts, and our thoughts need the overarching guidance of God or control. And it's like Father Tim's sermon today.
Mhm.
You know, if we let ourselves be deceived that we don't have the empowerment, then we're at further loss. So no condition has not already been overcome. And Christ died on the cross for us. So we have to stop our concerns at the thought.
yes, it's
We
just
have
that
to combat it in the thought.
that's where the warfare is.
So
It's in the thought.
so whenever you have the thought, would you just say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner?
That's a
Or
beautiful prayer, the Jesus prayer, right?
I mean that's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
You say
So
something?
I was just going to say that temptation is also an energy that God allows.
Yes.
And the thing is that, you know, even for Jesus, when he was tempted for 40 days, God allowed him to be tempted in his thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It's what he did with it.
Mhm. He did not sin. That's what separated. I mean, it says in Hebrews 2 and Hebrews 4, it reminds us that he went through every temptation that we go through, and he can be present in our temptation to help us because he understands it.
Yeah, he had to struggle through
He struggled through it. Yeah, it wasn't with.
divine humanity.
Yeah. Although the one thing in that vein that I still to this day struggle with, although I've heard some wonderful explanations through the years, is, you know, Christ 99.99999 to infinity was essentially nonviolent. But there was the one time that he did an action that when it went against that grain, when he was at the temple with the money changer.
And then he was extremely violent. That wasn't just a passive thing.
No, I know that.
Yeah.
And so I've heard a lot of sermons and read a lot of different people's, you know, thoughts on that. And, you know, to this day, I still struggle with that, but go in my mind, I go, okay, if we are to go and do likewise, you know, 99.99% of the time, not be violent, but even Christ got angry once in his earthly life for that. And that just means, I think, a lot of thought, as we've talked about here, we have to do a lot of thinking about the energies. you know, be thoughtful about the energies and what we're doing. But Christ did do that, so that gives you that gives me at least some pause to go, okay. Sometimes, you know, speak for myself, I struggle with, okay, and with this situation, you pray on it and think about what the best course is. You know, how do you, a better way to put it in line with this discussion is, what energy do you bring forth?
Kingdom of heaven is taken by force, right? Remember, it's spiritual. First of all, a couple of things. He didn't kill anybody as he drove them out of the temple, right? He was
Right.
cleansing the temple. The temple was a bastion of sin. There was land grabs, all kinds of stuff going on there to oppress people. They were, you know, it was horrible. So he was cleansing it. And that level of force is sometimes what's needed in our lives
Absolutely.
for cleansing, right?
Absolutely.
You
A
struggle.
vigorous response.
You've told a story multiple times
Yeah.
of struggling, you know, something you had to overcome before, you know, it took denial of communion
Right.
to break down.
Mhm.
Yeah, but that's spiritual warfare,
It's also righteous anger.
righteous
too.
anger.
Yeah, anger itself is not bad. It's
Right. It's
None of
why you're getting angry.
The desires aren't bad. The passions were given to us. It's the misdirection of them
Mhm.
that makes it bad, right?
I have a question. You know, while we're talking about this, so does that mean that there's like a good reason then, like a country would like go to war, or because war is bad?
That's beyond the scope of what we're talking about in terms of, we're not talking about physical warfare of people.
Oh,
But and we'll probably get into this next week. It's, you know, you look, that's hard. That's somewhat hard to reconcile, because we've been so fed this message about God's nature, where we only get the soft side, what we would think of as, in our limitation, as the soft side. But God does not tolerate sin,
Mhm.
pure and simple. And out of his loving nature, he does everything, gives us as individuals, gives us as communities, every opportunity to get past it. Look at Ahab, for example. Ahab married to Jezebel, a worshiper of Baal. I mean, you start peeling the onion beneath that story. It was pretty bad. He gave Ahab every opportunity to repent. But essentially, he finally said, Ahab is causing too much damage to other people around him, and took him out. We don't like to think of God in that capacity. Now, we don't understand all of God's ways, but God does not permit and allow sin forever. It's just not. And
That's took out the whole world except for Noah. And
because sin is an affront to God's nature. And this is where we're going to get into, and this gets a little tough sometimes, because we're talking about the energies. How then do we deal with people? Because and I'll get in, you know, we're not going to have enough time, but I don't know if he coined the term I'm about to say, or he's borrowing it, but Father Andrew Damick in his book Lord of Spirits talks about this. It's a really, I forget the chapter, it's a great chapter. But he talks about, you know, there's theosis, but then the opposite could be called demonosis, right? Talk about cooperation. Are we cooperating with God's synergy, or are we cooperating with the devil? You know, and some people cooperate so much. There is a capacity for human evil, right?
Mhm.
And then how do we deal with that? You know, in one way, you know, what we see in God's nature is this incredible patience, right? So
sorry.
that's okay. I hope I didn't trigger it, Joseph.
He's getting a
Yeah,
phone
he's
call.
fun.
Okay, good. So go ahead, Elizabeth.
I don't want to change your thought, right? But I want to go back to something that you said that
Yeah.
maybe needs clarification. Maybe you didn't mean it this way. But I think you said the passions are given to us by God. I don't know if you really meant that, because I don't think the passions.
Well, not the
are given to
passion.
us.
That's no, I don't mean that. But misdirected desires are the passions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility to what we do.
Yeah, thanks for that correction. I don't mean the passions like, you know, hunger is given to us, and we, you know, that desire to eat, but gluttony is a passion, right? You know, sex, but lust is a passion. You know, all these good and natural things.
Yeah.
So misdirected, they
Yeah.
become passion. Yeah, I don't mean the passions were given to us, the sins were given to us. No, thank you.
I have a question about that. So like, you know, like with hunger, like is it bad like when we say like oh that food tastes really good or that's that's really good? Isn't that almost gluttonous?
No, I say that every time I eat Maria's cooking. It's really good. No, of course what gluttonize, I have 4 plates, luckily I have the metabolism of a rodent, so my sin is covered, but it's still there, no, it's not nothing. No, see,
So like if you get a really good meal,
a good meal. Remember what God said in Genesis? He said it's all good. Then he said about mankind, it's very good. All the things they're all good. Food is good. All these things are good. What makes them not good is how we use them. It's not inherently bad. Food is not inherently.
Moderation.
Yeah, right.
And when we go back to anger, the challenge
Mhm.
for me, and I was in healthcare, the challenge for my clients was stopping at anger and not letting it go to hate. And if it goes to hate, it destroys people.
Hate's a spiritual
It
cancer.
destroys everybody.
Hate's a
That's-
spiritual cancer. It's a
Yes.
spiritual cancer that
Yep.
kills people,
That's where it develops.
and it's an
sin.
infectious disease that
Mhm.
other people catch, and we see time and time again God's mercy for those that are hateful is still loving. It's just it won't go on forever, right? Because some people that's why he said, and this is an uncomfortable truth. Christ said, you're gonna be raised to the resurrection of life or condemnation. Your choice to still hate when you've been given every opportunity to not hate is the resurrection of condemnation, right? That's why I'm saying, we're in our world, this is nothing new, but as we enter into these political seasons, there's a lot of hate going around. We can't succumb to it. That's all I'm saying. It doesn't mean you don't pick a person or a party or a position or anything in life. It's just not succumbing to hatred. It's that simple. You can have strong convictions about many things. You just can't succumb to hatred. That's the energy of the devil, right?
Great meme that I use sometimes on social media. Be careful what you demonize, lest you become it.
Yeah. There's I remember in Tolkien's world, he was so wise. He said, the study the arts of the enemy is perilous because you become them, right? Like studying evil is never a good thing. You don't want to study evil to understand evil. You will understand evil proportionate to how much you understand good, right? Don't study the arts of the enemy. It's a waste of time. Even J.K. Rowling figured that out in the Harry Potter series, the dark arts. Don't study the dark arts, as much as you think. I mean, there's you see this crop up in literature and stories, but that's a mistake that a lot of people get fascinated. They get fascinated with evil because they want to triumph. And all they're doing is opening themselves up to more of it. The good in Christ will reveal, the light reveals the dark, not going into the dark. So
I wish in some of my situations I could have taken my clients to church, but I can't clinically. So, but I grab them by the back.
But you know what? You can
take them to the nervous hospital.
But you know what? We can all be church to people through. We are His imagers, His image and likeness. So whenever, in God, most of us would love to have some kind of really cool mystical experience of God, but usually, almost all the time, our experience of God is through other people because God's goodness is at work through people. And that's why being in community and under communal understanding and the good that we do, when you do something good, you're God. I mean, I don't mean it like that. You know what I'm saying, right? I hope you know what I'm saying. It's just you're participating in God,
So it takes that noetic or nous to really better perceive that, I think.
Well, you have to believe it, number one. You have to believe if you walked out of here and someone was on the street you encountered and you give that person a ride, that's God's goodness. That's God. You know what I'm saying? You have to believe that. You can't just say, well, that's just me. That's not God.
So even the smallest act of charity, like you're participating in the goodness.
The widow with the 2 mites, right?
Mhm.
That's why he praised that above all else, because she gave so much of herself. She was participating in that. And that was closer to Christ emptying sacrifice of himself than someone that was giving out of their abundance. That's why the deed was praised for what it is. So, yeah. Anyway, I hope this was all useful today. I hope it. I think next week we'll get into a little bit more of, I won't call it the money changes, but understanding how we deal with, when we're dealing with ourselves or other people that are bad or evil. understanding what's behind that, while at the same time understanding choice and how we need to get into that a little bit. So, all right, well, those of you that listened online, God bless you all. Well, God bless everybody. But thank you for joining online. And as I said, if there's any questions during the week, we said a lot today. So if anybody happens to listen to the whole thing, you may have more questions. And of course, I always try to answer everything to the best of my ability. Sometimes I'm okay with it. Sometimes my limitations are revealed. But we'll be back. It's 25th of February. Yeah, I was going to go out of town next week, but I'm not now. So we'll be back next Sunday. And so until we see you again, God bless. Have a wonderful week, and see you next week.